All right, and so my other hat is I'm on extension staff here at the University of Nebraska. For those of you who don't know extension, what we do is take what comes from the researchers and take it out and teach it to farmers is our traditional audience, but it's now expanding into urban audiences, 4-H, as well as K through 12. I'm going to primarily talk about working with adult audiences. We were tasked with helping educators throughout the nation become more confident and up to speed on how to talk about climate change, because it's kind of a new topic up and coming. Let me see if we can figure it out. Nope.
The silver plate.
Maybe.
You can also use the arrow keys on the keyboard.
Okay. We'll just do that. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about how we did it, and then I'm going to talk about kind of our takeaways from a theory standpoint. Basically, we were a multi-regional project, so we had extension and faculty at 5 different universities across the country, and we worked together through a national group called the Livestock and Poultry Environmental Learning Center. So all of these resources are on that website if you want to check them out later. Of course, got to acknowledge our funders through the USDA. Just wanted to pop that up there, the ones who helped make this happen over the last 6 years. So we've been doing this for a while now. And basically what we decided that we needed to do was equip educators both in their knowledge levels, so learning the science, but also their motivation and ability to actually take that science out. We're going to provide some of the latest research and science information, and then coordinate this across different levels so that there's a very small number of faculty working in this field. How do we give them the best impact across the nation? And so I won't bore you, I mean, you don't need to read this, but I put it in here in case you want to see it. This is a tool we use in extension to talk about how do we have impact. So the idea is the first level is very basic impact, where you might reach a lot of people, which is talking about questions, all the way up to where we have the most impact. These are our really in-depth programs. And so our effort kind of covered this entire gamut. I won't go through all of it, but we can talk about it more if you want to see kind of how to do this. One of our key things we did was develop an online course. This was kind of our pinnacle impact to where we had 7 different modules, and this changed throughout development with some of the theory I'm going to talk about next of the order to present these in and the information that educators really needed to get their hands on. And the big one we added, which was my focus, is the climate change communication module. And so this is really about how do we communicate the science. Because when we talk to people, they're like, I can get really comfortable with the science, but I don't know how to talk to people about it. I'm really nervous because this is a controversial topic. So how do we better get them ready to actually take it out and talk about it? So again, a busy slide if you want to read it later. But this was just, we did a survey of everyone who did it. So we had approximately 1,200 contacts throughout the project. This is our survey of those folks. And the main thing I want to show, several of these have communication metrics to it. So this one was their ability. So the second one down was inform others about this topic. So that's the communication itself. And it was the one that had our greatest impact as far as people felt much more able to really go out and talk about this subject. And there again, also on motivation. So yes, I know how to do it, and maybe I'll actually go do it. So these were our 2 metrics that we really wanted to get at. And there again, we had large increases in how those people felt like they were able to do it. So I'll leave that for the last of my kind of data to show up here. And now let's flip over and talk about what were our takeaways over these last 6 years in working. We had a lot of social scientists we work with. I'm an engineer, but I have a lot of background in communication. And so as we collaborated, these are some of our big takeaways. Kind of at the beginning, and I think this is true across a lot of topics, we're like, why don't people just understand the science? And if they knew more, oh, sorry, we've got some of these on automatic slide. And what it comes down to is that people have different worldviews. And if you can't read it, it goes from being an individualistic to being more communitarian on one side, egalitarian to hierarchical. Sorry about the automatic things. But those worldviews really influence how we understand science. They call it cultural cognition. So we don't always process information in the same way depending on our worldview. So where you have to start is you take that into account. First, know yourself. Because if people don't understand why you care, it makes them much more skeptical about how they're going to interact with you. So do some self-reflection. What's my worldview? What's my bias? Why? What's your big why? Why do you care about your science? Sorry, that's a bit dark for some reason. So anyway, so we did some surveying, because the next step is to know your audience. So this is a survey of farmers and farm advisors that we did. This is actually higher than the U.S. average, which was surprising to some because there's a lot of debate in the agricultural circles about what the cause is. That's the split out here. But overall, they believe there is something going on. They're out there in the field. They can see it happening. And so what that basically means is they're ready to talk about adaptation. They might not be ready to talk about how are we going to mitigate it, because that assumes that it's our fault. But they're ready to talk about adaptation. So that's where we start. And another way to help start the conversation is to talk about local history. People's experiences aren't controversial. I mean, maybe they can be, but in general, your own experiences are something you can bring to the table and say, this is something I've experienced. So in long memory here, we've got the Dust Bowl. In recent memory, we've got flooding and droughts in recent memory. And then we can bring some science to the table and say, this is what the climatology, and this is not into the future, this is historical climatology, what the data says, to match it up to people's experiences. So that's a really great way to start the conversation, and that's where we started our online course. Was let's talk about what's the historical trends and how it's impacting you on your operations. So we're talking about farmers, but this is true, in whatever industry you might be talking with. And then another big piece of this is how do we frame it so that they can hear it. And again, a busy slide, but basically this was part of our survey to say, what are they concerned about? And so we had a fairly high level concern over a lot of different things. There's drought and flooding and weeds and anyway, so there's things that they're concerned about that are impacting them day to day. So if we can make sure we're talking about the science that relates to them and their concerns, then we are saying it in a way that they will hear it and they can start to talk about it and they can see how, in our case, climate change can start to impact these things. So, and then the next piece is people make their decisions because of those worldviews based on their value systems. And so we need to find ways that we can bring those value systems together. We need to look at their base concerns and what are those values and where do they overlap. So I won't go into too much detail, but we've got lots more information on how to do it. So then once you have that, then you can start to talk about new information. So we need to say it in ways that can be heard, which is a lot of what our previous speaker was talking about. But we use data and we use imagery because that uses both sides of your brain. And then that data needs to be concrete. It needs to be as local as possible, like what's going on in their life, and it needs to be happening now. And so in climate change, we often get too focused far in the future, but there's things that we need to do now. And that's the stuff that people are really interested in. And then this goes back to also what our previous speaker was talking about, is how the scientists talk about information. So when I go to science conferences, this is how we do our presentations. We do background and then we come to the point. The public, in a news story, think about it, it's totally flipped. And so this is another way that we think about how do we talk differently so that we're heard. And then last, we can start to talk about how do we create solutions to these problems using science. And we need to approach it as a co-creation, particularly on controversial topics. People are a little skeptical, they don't want to be told what to do. So how can we bring our information to them? And then when you start to look at solutions, let's find ones that tie into these values that we identified with people, and where can we find interrelationships that are win-win across different solutions. And let's start there. Maybe we need to move to something harder, but to start, you got to start in places where we can work together. And then we have lots of different resources we put together to help people see success stories. And so these are in different media. This is conferences, we've got YouTube videos, we've got publications, we've got on farm so they can come see it in person. So you do lots of different ways to show them what's working. And then finally, we want to, people are really, to connect with the science, they need to see how it's going to apply to their lives, particularly when we're talking adult education. People have lots of other worries, lots of things going on in their life. They want to know, what's this do for me? And so we need to challenge ourselves to think about how can we make it clear how this will impact their life, and then point back to where are their gaps in basic science. And this is why science is important, because we don't necessarily know all the answers. So I would challenge us all to think about how we can relate our science to their life. So this is just a summary of things that worked, is that we need to learn ourselves how to teach science better, and we need to teach other scientists and other educators how to better communicate these things. When you start to take it out, you need to meet people where they're at, make it easy to understand, make it local and related to their experience. And then we need to make sure that we're saying things in ways that can be heard, whether that's the language we're using, like we're talking about, using media forms that they're already in. All of those things help it be heard and retained. And then when we come to solutions, particularly on some of these more controversial topics, we need to co-create the solution so people are bought into it and they feel like their voices were heard in the process. And finally, we need to help them see how science applies to their life and why what we're doing in the lab is so critical to what's going on in their life and how we move forward in these challenges. So with that, I'll leave it with something that I think we get hung up on, some of these controversial things. There's things that we can answer in science, and then there's things that ethics can answer. So sometimes we will never come to an agreement, and that's okay. That's what it's about, being people and facilitating conversations. So with that, I'll leave you some references here. My contact information's up there. A lot of our information, this is a really great publication, The Psychology of Climate Change Communication. And then our website for our project is up there. So there's lots of great resources to learn more about how to communicate, particularly climate change, but I think it applies to a lot of some of the pressing topics that we're dealing with in science, where science and society merge. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
Endorse everything that you said, but as a science journalist, I know there's a danger in that last one. The temptation to tell people how it will apply to their lives has led to at least 10,000 reports of cancer being cured, for example. How do you not oversell the story?
Sure, I think that, the hard part is making sure that we can effectively communicate the uncertainty and risk pieces, and people don't like to talk about uncertainty and risk, and we have a whole section in our longer materials on how to talk about that, because there's some of these things that we partially know the answer to, but as scientists we always say, well, maybe. Yeah. But that doesn't always go over well in a headline or in a story, and so I think that that's a good place where journalists and scientists need to come together to really kind of, how do you get catchy headlines that aren't overselling it? I think it's something to be cautious of.
You mentioned the value and importance of using local data. What are good ways to get local data?
So in our realm of dealing with climatology, we're really fortunate that the United States has a really long history of recording meteorological data. And so from that standpoint, and same in agriculture, we've recorded agricultural statistics for a very long time. And so I guess we're fortunate maybe to be in fields that have that long history of data. But I think, whatever history we have is good experience to put up there. And some of what we've done is we have people even just tell their stories, and so that's where we can bring in their personal experiences and tell their stories of what they remember or what stories they heard from their parents and grandparents, and then relate it to what data we do have to either, so I'm a fan, I think, so we talk about hard data versus anecdote. well, for a lot of people, anecdote is the truth. Like for them, that's their personal truth. And so if we can either confirm that or maybe question it with some data, that helps bring some context to a sometimes challenging discussion. So that's kind of a long answer to finding data, but.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome, thanks.